If you want to, go ahead and turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 2. That's where we're going to be today, in Matthew chapter 2. You know, it goes without saying that the holiday season, the Christmas holiday season, has more fanfare or activity than pretty much any other holiday in the year. It invites a wide variety of emotions and attitudes surrounding Christmas that you don't see in any other holiday. For many, for example, it's a season of hope and family and joy. For some, it accentuates battles with loneliness and depression and sadness. And for others, it's not depressing, but for them, it just kind of falls into the category of annoying and bothersome. They just kind of get tired of it all. Now, some, like me, can't wait until the day after Thanksgiving when the WBOW radio station, 102.7, begins their 24 hours of Christmas music. That's about the only time of the year I actually turn the radio on. And I just love listening to Christmas music. For some, like my lovely bride, the season is ready for cheesy, romantic Hallmark Christmas movies night after night. Anybody else like that? Like all the Hallmark movies? So, and I've kind of gotten to where I've watched a few of them, but I'm more of I lean more toward the older classics. I like It's a Wonderful Life or Miracle on 34th Street, or one of my favorites, A Christmas Carol. But in the year 2000, another well-done movie, in which actor comedian Jim Carrey brilliantly brought to life a character first created in 1957 by children's book writer Theodore Geisel, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, also known as Dr. Seuss. And the character he created, of course, was the Grinch. I think that's your hero, right? The Grinch? Okay, that's what I tease her all the time about being the Grinch, though, to Gracie. But anyway, Dr. Seuss said later on in an interview that he based the Grinch on himself. When one year on December the 26th, he was brushing his teeth and he noticed the scouring look on the face in the mirror, his own. And his Grinch-like attitude, he testified, was the result of his wife's health problems at that time, mixed with his complete dismay about the commercialization of Christmas. I'm sure many of you probably share that part of it. But his goal in writing the book, he testified, was to rediscover something about Christmas that he had lost. Now, in the story of the Grinch, as most of you know, the Grinch lived in a cave on a mountain just outside of a small town called Whoville, up on the mountain, and the Whoville is down below. After 53 years, which is one of the reasons why it's based on Dr. Seuss, because he was 53 years old when he wrote this. But after 53 years of being annoyed by the Christmas celebrations down below every year, the Grinch decides he's going to try and cancel or destroy or basically just do away with Christmas. So falsely believing that it was all about the festivities and the presents and the trees and so on, he decided to dress up as Santa Claus, slide down the chimney, steal all the presents, the trees, and the food that the families were preparing for the feast, and then take them up and take them all out to the edge of a big dumpster and just wait till the next morning. And he wakes up in the morning expecting to hear everyone mourning and wailing, down below in the valley. But he's shocked to hear the entire village singing a joyous Christmas song in spite of having everything stolen. And he comes to realize that for the people of Whoville, there was a lot more to Christmas than the presents and the festivities. And of course, he had the change of heart. Now, I don't know if Dr. Seuss had ever thought about it while writing this book, but in the book, by the way, is originally titled How the Grinch Stole Christmas. But interestingly enough, the real Christmas story of the Bible also contained an actual Grinch-like character, except he didn't try to ruin Christmas by stealing all the presents and the trees and casting them into the abyss. He wasn't interested in killing the joy of Christmas. Instead, he made it his life goal, or his goal at that time, or an effort to kill the Christ of Christmas as a toddler. And of course, I'm talking about a well-known king by the name of Herod the Great. Unlike the Grinch of Dr. Seuss, he never had a change of heart, and his actions were a whole lot more horrendous than just stealing a few presents and some food. Now, for those of you who haven't been with it the past few weeks, I want to just kind of bring you up to date. We've been looking at how different people responded to the news of the announcement and or the arrival of Jesus. In the first 2 weeks, we looked at two of what we would call the protagonists of the story, which is Joseph and Mary. For Mary, it was shocking news, right? I mean, she was just a humble girl from a no-name town in the mountains, a town that had a poor reputation on top of that. Why would God pay any attention to her, lest yet choose her as the one who would bring his only begotten son into the world? But Mary's story reminded us that none of us are hidden from God's sight, no matter where we live. Her character taught us that what can happen if we choose to consistently live in the presence of God. And her story reminded that sometimes God's call in our life can put us in some very challenging circumstances or situations, but that if we're willing to put obedience above everything else, God can use us to bless the entire world. For Joseph, who we talked about last week, it was at first upsetting news, because he thought the love of his life had betrayed him, and beyond that, lied to him about it. He lost his trust. But we learned so much about the character of Joseph, the way he responded to the news. Instead of choosing vindictiveness and revenge, he chose to show mercy and compassion. It revealed why the Bible said that he was a righteous man. He kept himself from rushing into a reaction, and as a result, he gave God the time to change his mind and his pathway. And because of how he responded to God's communication to him in a dream, Joseph also reminded us that when we hear from God, we need to let what we hear eclipse whatever we might fear. It wouldn't be an easy journey to walk with Mary for Joseph. And he wasn't given insight on what the future held. He didn't know that the story we're going to read today was going to happen. But he trusted God nonetheless, and as a result became the earthly father of God's own son. Now today, as we close out this Christmas story, we're going to kind of zoom in on the ultimate antagonist of the Christmas and see exactly what drove this man named Herod to do some of the heinous things that he did, and what spiritual lessons that we might be able to learn from him. So to help us to do that, we're going to read out of Matthew chapter 2. I'm going to go ahead and read this, probably about the first 18 verses. So just follow along. I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For it is written by the prophet, meaning Micah, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and he ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasure, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. And he said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose, meaning Joseph. He rose, and he took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt. Can you imagine that? You got guests or whatever in your house, or your next door neighbor come over. Well, that was kind of rude. They just left. Where'd they go? Kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, and he rose and he took the child and his mother by night, departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. He sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and wild lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Now, before we get into talking about Herod, I want to address a few kind of critical things about the text itself that Matthew writes down here. The first thing I want us to take note of is that the events of this chapter do not take place on the night of the birth as often is depicted in nativity scenes and Christmas movies, okay? It takes place probably about a year or more later, or maybe give or take a month or two. Now, we know this for a couple of different reasons. First, because the word Matthew uses the 9 different times in these verses a word that's recorded as the word child. And it's a word that means toddler or child in training. It's vastly different than the word that's used for newborn baby. Because Herod ordered the slaughter of boys 2 years and under based on the wise men timing of the star, we assume that Jesus is still less than 2 years old. Another reason we know this, though, is because when the Magi do finally locate Jesus and his family, they are no longer in the place where a manger was. A manger, as you may have heard me talk about in the past, was a birthing station, usually inside of a tower out in the shepherd's field. That's probably where they were. In fact, if you go back in the Old Testament, there's a verse that talks about, "O tower of the flock." And it was I'm trying to think of the name of it now. I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, that's most likely where Jesus was born, where the sacrificial lambs were actually born, out in the field in Bethlehem, the shepherd's field. And anyway, but now, and then verse 9 through 11, they are in a house, still in Bethlehem, which indicates that they probably decided to stay for a time after Jesus was born. Maybe for logistic reasons or weather reasons, or maybe they didn't want to go back to a town where there might have been a lot of turmoil about the pregnancy. We don't know why, but they decided to stay in Bethlehem. Now, the reason the visit of the Magi kind of gets lumped into a lot of nativity scenes today is because of where the event is recorded in the biblical narrative at the beginning in Matthew, and because the events accommodating the birth of Jesus led to the eventual visit. So it kind of makes some sense. Now, while the inclusion of the wise men in the nativity scene doesn't change anything theologically, it should at least remind us that just how easily inaccurate details can get lumped into biblical or historical truth. It's a reminder of how important it is that we take the time to study God's Word to find truth and not just accept what we normally see on movies or read in books or look at nativity scenes. The second important fact to be aware of in Matthew's text is that we now know that Herod died sometime around 4 BC, which means that Jesus was most likely born around 5 or 6 BC. And this story takes place somewhere in between all that. It kind of messes up the calendar we go by today, but, too late to change it now. A third matter that I want to briefly touch on is the identity of the Magi and this special star. Now, we could easily spend entire messages on looking at all the possibilities and theories that have developed over the years. The truth is, being 2,000 years removed from that time period, it's really hard to know with any kind of certainty who these men were or what the star was. In regard to the Magi, nowhere does Scripture say that there was only 3 of them. That's another myth that's kind of perpetuated by culture, right, over the years. And mainly because there were 3 types of gifts, so they assumed one guy per gift. But there could have been quite a few of wise men or Magi. Some suggest that because of their high-ranking prominence and position in their home country, not only were they probably more than 3, but they would have been accompanied by an entourage of servants and likely even escorted by a small squadron of protective soldiers. Not enough to make it appear like a military threat, but at least enough to kind of help them, because this would have been a journey of probably a couple months at least. Now, without going into detail, though, it is generally agreed that the Magi were Gentile men, most likely from Persia or Arabia, or somewhere in that area, and that they were well-versed in science and astronomy, and that they may have had some familiarity with Jewish scriptures, particularly the prophecies of Daniel. In fact, if you look in history, Daniel was one of those Magi, or helped train other Magi in the Old Testament. So we don't know if they're connected to them or not. But it is their intimate familiarity with the stars, mixed with the belief that the heavenly bodies have some kind of religious significance in their movement, that helped lead them to the conclusion that something special was going on in Israel. Another interesting fact, though, recorded by multiple historians of that day, including Josephus as well as Roman historians, is that there was a strong anticipation and expectation of a king coming out of Israel around this time period. And that's spoken of by Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. It was just a strong anticipation. Now, whether that was a result of years of Jewish people talking about it, or just a result of God moving in people's hearts, we don't really know. But you put all those factors together, it's easy to see how these wise men and these Magi discovered something unique happening in the heavens. And today, you and I, we hardly know anything about the stars, unless you maybe, unless you're out in the ocean a lot and you kind of follow the stars as the guiding point. But in those days, that was a very common thing. And again, you put all those factors together, you can see that they were most likely not surprised by the star in heaven, but that they were actually looking for it. But what was this star of Bethlehem that they took note of? What did it look like? Where was it from? What made it stand out? Well, again, there's a lot of theories about that. Some have suggested a comet of some sort. We do know that Halley's Comet went through the area about 12 BC, but that would have been several years before. Some have suggested a comet or a supernova, which refers to what kind of happens when a heavenly body appears to the naked eye. Is typically a powerful, luminous explosion of what's considered a new star. And interestingly enough, one source said that according to Chinese record, there was a prominent supernova recorded around 5 BC. So maybe that was it, who knows? A third option that came about in the 17th century that has actually gained traction over the years is that an alignment of the stars during this era created a planetary conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, making it look like one giant, very bright star. And it still happens today. It happens every so often. In fact, in this year they called it a triple conjunction because it happened 3 times in around 7 BC. So that's another possibility. A fourth option is that it was an angel of some kind or even the Shekinah glory of God. And the wording in verse 9 in which it says that the star came to rest over the place where the child is or was, kind of lead me to believe that it was something more than just a celestial body, at least at that point anyway. We don't really know, and it's always fun to speculate, and one of these days we hopefully will find out. But what we do know is that prominent Gentile men from 1,000 miles away were aware that someone or something important was happening, and someone important was being born, and deserved to be paid honor. And so they began a journey that led them to Judea. With Jerusalem being the capital, that's where they show up, assuming that everyone, or at least someone, would know or would have a clue. And the arrival and the questions that they were asking caused great concern. And eventually their inquiries got the attention of Herod, who called for a meeting with these guys to see what all the hubbub was about. And accepting their conclusions as truth and connecting it to the prophecy of the Messiah, he called in the Jewish scholars to narrow down where the Messiah was to be born. Now, the fourth matter regarding, another matter regarding what Matthew is what some might think as the proverbial elephant in the room. When you compare Matthew's recording of Jesus' birth and his early years to that of Luke, we discover that Luke doesn't mention this at all. Considering that Luke claims that he is writing an accurate account for the intended reader, it's interesting to note that he doesn't say anything about the Magi, or about the massacre, or about the move to Egypt at all. In fact, he almost makes it sound like right after all the temple things after Jesus' birth, that they go on to Nazareth. But he kind of skips over about a 2-year period there. But because of that, and because of the murder of Bethlehem boys isn't mentioned in any other historical record, many have accused Matthew of just kind of making up this story. For what reason, I don't know. But however, when you read about the life of Herod the Great, you're left with no doubt that Matthew is telling the truth. And sadly, the massacre pales in comparison, though, to many of the other atrocities that he did throughout his life, and what he was preparing to do at the end of his life, which most likely took place a very short time after this event. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Herod, the original Grinch. After kind of a rough start, his political and military genius ultimately helped him to unseat the Maccabees. Some of you probably have heard of them. In the Catholic Bible, there was actually 2 books called First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. The Maccabees were a very prominent and ruling family up until the time that Herod came along. In fact, Herod married into that family and then kind of did away with them. But he helped them to unseat, he helped his military genius helped him to unseat the Maccabees, and he took over as king of all Judea and Samaria and Galilee and quite a few others, under the authority of Caesar Augustus. How many of you have ever read Julius Caesar in high school? Anybody remember that story? I know I had to. Did you guys have to read that? Well, in that story are 2 men called Mark Antony, who married Cleopatra, and Octavian. Remember those guys? Well, Caesar Augustus is Octavian. That's who he was. Okay, and so, but what's interesting is that Octavian and Mark Antony had a falling out. Well, Herod chose Mark Antony. He chose with him. When Octavian killed Mark Antony, just to give you an idea of how good Herod was at political stuff, he had to all of a sudden let Octavian or Caesar Augustus know that he would side with him now, or that he would honor him. And so he did. So he was very politically astute. Now the Roman Senate referred to him as the King of the Jews, which did not sit well with a lot of his subjects. Because at best, he was a half-Jew, and that only by conversion, not by birth. His mother was Arab, and his father was from the lineage of Esau, not Jacob. And Jacob and Esau is where it kind of divides off. And he was from the lineage of Esau, or Edom, or Edomite. But his father had converted to Judaism, and so therefore he was considered half-Jewish. In his early years, Herod was extremely successful in making and keeping the peace in the area of Judea, which no one else had ever been able to accomplish, or ever since been able to accomplish. In 25 BC, during a harsh famine, he actually canceled taxes to give his people relief, and went so far as to melt down his own gold to buy food and corn for those who were starving. So in the beginning of his kingship, he appears to be good for the people. But even more impressive than his political astuteness was his leadership in some of the greatest building projects in history. He built the city of Caesarea single-handedly, along with a harbor using the latest technology in hydraulic cement and underwater construction, which was way ahead of his time. Some of the remains of his constructions are still visible today, 2,000 years later. He built other cities, including 7 impressive fortresses that kind of became an escape place for him in case of an insurrection. One of them is famously known as Masada. He gave Judea, however you want to say it, a facelift and a whole new identity. But his greatest building accomplishment by far was the expansion of the Temple Mount. He basically doubled that, and he remodeled the temple itself, causing them to become one of the greatest wonders of the world for a short time. And in doing so, per Jewish law, he even used only the priests as masons and carpenters in the project. Now, those great things characterized his first 24 to 25 years of leadership. In spite of all that, though, the last decade would become unraveled as his personal life just became a mess, and a result of insecurity and paranoia and a desire to hold on to the power at all costs. He was constantly worried about losing the throne. And when you look at some of the history of his family, he had some good reason to think that. But so much, though, that he murdered many of his own family members, including his favorite wife. He had 10 wives, and his favorite one was actually from the Maccabees. Her name was... I can't remember, Miriamnes, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but nevertheless, that was his favorite wife. He murdered her and her mom because he felt that they were going to try to take over the kingdom. They were going to dethrone him. Even more than that, he had 3 of his own sons killed for the very same reason. 3 of his own children. Add to this several cousins and uncles, and it's no wonder that Caesar Augustus once famously said of him, "It is better and safer to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons." That's just how atrocious he had become. And in spite of all that he had done in his early years of leadership and all the building projects, he alienated many of the Jews because of his allegiance to Rome. Herod knew that he had become hated by everyone and that no one would mourn his death. And just kind of the coup d'etat and everything else, to ensure that on the day of his death it would be full of tears and not celebration, he had many of the leaders of Israel arrested and thrown in the dungeon to be held until the day he died. He knew his death was coming very soon. And the goal was that on the day of his death, they would immediately be executed, the Israelite leaders, so that there would be great mourning in the city instead of celebration because of his death. I mean, this is how twisted this guy really was. So I ask you, does a man with that kind of insecurity and paranoia and narcissism seem like he would have any problem going to the extreme to murder small toddlers upon hearing that one of them might take over his throne that day or soon? Not at all. It's not hard to believe at all. Is it any wonder that when an entourage of impressive-looking men show up from out of town to pay honor to such a child, that he would feel threatened? He tried to use their curiosity and their desire to have them do the dirty work for him, pretending that he too wanted to be able to honor and worship the boy. But what Herod failed to realize is that you can't outsmart the God of the universe, who can easily speak through dreams, which he's already done several times and does again with these magi. And as a result, the wise men eventually travel safely home by another route, and their gifts give the family of Jesus all the financial resources they would need to escape to Egypt for a while. When they didn't come back, this only elevated Herod's rage, and of course that's when he carried out this destruction of the Bethlehem, or what we call the Bethlehem massacre, or the butcher of Bethlehem, or whatever you want to refer to it. All these young boys 2 years and under would be murdered. Now, in that small village at that time in Bethlehem, you're probably talking about less than 20. But nevertheless, it's still horrific. But in comparison to all the other delusional things Herod was doing as his death approached, especially having his own son just put to death just prior to this, it probably didn't make much news in the day. So that's why we probably don't see it in any other historical writing. But as we consider Herod's story in this response to the announcement and the arrival of the one who would become king, there's a couple of things I want us to learn from this story as we go forward. First, no matter how it appears, no earthly authority will keep God from accomplishing his purpose. Herod thought he could stop the plans of God through this trickery and this murder. But God was way much smarter than he was. God said through the mouth of Isaiah in Isaiah 14, he said, the Lord of heaven's army has sworn this oath. It will all happen as I have planned, meaning just life in general. It will all happen as I have planned. It will all be as I have decided. I have a plan for the whole earth, a hand of judgment upon all the nations. The Lord has spoken. Who can change his plan? When his hand is raised, who can stop him? A little later in Isaiah, he says something similar in Isaiah chapter 46, beginning of verse 9. He says, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient time things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Herod only sat on the throne that he sat on because God allowed it. Remember what Jesus said to Pilate? He goes, the only authority you have is because my Father has given it to you. The same thing with Herod. He thought he was above it all. He thought he could hold on to something that didn't really belong to him anyway. And he resorted to murderous ways to protect a position that God could have removed him from in a flash had he so desired. Secondly, Herod tried to kill Jesus because he wanted to stay on the throne. Unfortunately, people today do the same thing. Not to hold on to a physical throne, but because they don't want to give up the throne of the heart. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2-5 says, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, and having the appearance of godliness, but denying his power. And sadly, he's talking about 2,000 years ago. Boy, it sure looks like today, doesn't it? But, a lot of times we look at Scripture like that, and we look at all the people outside of us, think, that's all them, that's not us. But maybe those things should make us challenge us to look in our own heart, to do as Dr. Seuss did. What did the faith look like in the mirror? What did the spirit of the heart look like in the mirror? But also know this, God offered a greater promise. He offered the greater promise to take over the throne of our heart. He put it this way in Ezekiel 36. He said, then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. Your filth will be washed away, and you will no longer worship idols. I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you. I will take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my spirit in you so that you will follow all my decrees and be careful to obey all my regulations. In other words, he promises if we allow him to take over the throne of our heart. And we don't have to worry about doing the kind of things that Herod did, or feel insecure or threatened by anything else, because we have the God of creation in our hearts. Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world, right? The last thing I wanted to take away from the story is that there were actually three different responses represented in it. Obviously, there's Herod, who's threatened by the presence of Jesus. The wise men who walked hundreds of miles over a couple of months to meet, and even met with a dangerous king, and still searched out Jesus to worship him. But did you notice that there was a third party involved in this story? Whatever happened to the priest? They come and they answer this question about Messiah to be born, but then they disappear from the scene. They don't join in the journey to Bethlehem, right? To pay honor to the Messiah. Men from 1,000 miles away come and they just act indifferent. And that kind of represents a lot of what happens today in the world. People just acting indifferent. Herod and the priests failed to see the Christ of Christmas because they failed to perceive who he was. Jennifer often jokes about me when she asked me to find something, and in fact she just did it this morning in my office. When I look for something and I don't see it, and she'll move something and there it is, right? She goes, "Stop looking with your man eyes." Yeah, I don't know if any other women do that, but that's what she called them, your man eyes. Now I don't know if Jesus called it that, but he definitely referred to carnal eyes when he wrote this, when he said this in this prophecy. He said this fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, talking about men who didn't perceive who he was. He said, when you hear what I say, you will not understand. When you see what I do, you will not comprehend. For the hearts of those people are hardened, and their ears cannot hear. And they have closed their eyes, so their eyes cannot see. And their ears cannot hear, and their hearts cannot understand. And they cannot turn to me and let me heal them. He's talking about people who looked with man eyes, right? Carnal eyes. Failed to see who Jesus was. Herod and the priests and all the people he called to help with that. That's who they were. Their indifference caused them to have man eyes. But Jesus goes on to say this. He said, but blessed are your eyes, because they do see, and your ears, because they do hear. And I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but they didn't see it. And they long to hear what you hear, but they didn't hear it. And that's why we celebrate Christmas, because we finally see and we perceive, and we stop looking with our carnal eyes, and we look with our spiritual eyes, and we ask Jesus to sit on the throne of our heart. Let's pray.